Okay, I think I'm live. If anyone out there wants to send me a message, thank you. Hooray! um, all right, got my 1 minute before I get started. I thought I'd reward those of you that showed up early and give you an extra fun fact that maybe the others won't get, and that's I was going to start this out by wearing a mask and snorkel, but turns out what they don't tell you is that if you wear a snorkel or a regulator out of the water, it actually makes you dribble a little bit. So I thought I'd be professional and not do that. All right. Snacks. Cool. Well, thanks everyone for joining already. All right, we'll get started. So, hello, everyone that's here with me today. Welcome to another Earth Live lesson. My name is Maya Santangelo, and I'm a marine biologist and professional diver. I'm currently somewhere not very close to the ocean and unable to dive at the moment, so a big thank you again to Lizzie for having me today, and thanks to all of you that are here live already to watch. I'm really excited today. I'm going to share with you what it's like to dive in Antarctica and some of the weird and wonderful life that exists in the coldest waters on the planet. So to start with a little bit of background, I learned to dive when I was 14, and my experiences in diving, probably unsurprisingly, are what fueled my interest to become a dive instructor and study marine biology. But I can confidently say that I never imagined that I would ever be diving in Antarctica. The majority of my early career experience actually involved working and diving in tropical places, but today I now spend the best part of my year diving in cold water, working as an undersea specialist for Lindblad National Geographic Expeditions. And this means that I have the very fun and very fortunate opportunity to go diving in some of the most remote places on the planet, film the coolest things I can find, and then bring that back to the surface and present them for others to see. So most people don't usually think of what lives underwater when they think of or come to visit Antarctica. It's such an incredible place. I feel so lucky every time I go there. But the best thing about it is that everything we love to see above the surface, the penguins, the seals, the whales, these are all marine species and they're connected to and rely on the ocean. So it's a huge privilege to be able to share the other half of the story of what makes this place so special. And it's always very exciting to share things that people probably didn't expect to see and maybe didn't know existed. So as I continue along, please feel free to ask any questions in the live chat. I'll get to those at the end. I would love for you to let me know some of the things that you think we might see underwater in Antarctica. So the first and probably most obvious thing to prepare for diving in Antarctica is that it is very, very cold. The water is typically between 0 and minus 1.8 degrees Celsius, or about 28 degrees Fahrenheit. This means that going for a dive here requires a lot more gear than usual and takes quite a long time to get ready. The secret to diving in Antarctica is layers. Lots and lots of layers. Water has a high thermal conductivity, which means you lose heat about 25 times faster in water than you do in air. In cold water, we wear what's called a dry suit. This is sort of the underwater version of a spacesuit. It's made of a tough outer material and has a watertight zipper, neck seals, and wrist seals to keep us dry, and we wear specially designed undergarments to keep us warm underneath, and as well as gloves that lock onto our suit. They keep our hands dry, and a thick neoprene hood for our heads. I personally also wear a heat job diving in Antarctica, and the important thing to know is that when I decided to pursue a career in diving, I didn't do it because it thought it made me look good. Now, planning to go diving in Antarctica is not like going to dive for anywhere else in the world. There are no dive shops here and no local guides to show us the best sites. So this means that diving here definitely has an exploratory element to it. Sometimes we're diving in places where possibly no one else ever has, and we often never know what we're going to find. Once we get to our dive site, there's still plenty more gear to put on. For the most part, we use standard scuba setups to dive in Antarctica with a few additional components for safety, as well as extra weight for all those layers we're wearing. The biggest difference I can say about diving in Antarctica is that everything I ever hoped about being a strong, independent woman, I threw out the window here, because once you have achieved your maximum marshmallow mode, you definitely want all the extra help you can get to put on your dive gear. At this point, you've probably been getting ready for as long as you're actually going to be diving for, so we can't wait to get in the water no matter how cold it is. When we first descend to dive, the marine environment may not look like anything very exciting. And that's because Antarctica is dominated by ice. What we see above the surface is literally just a tiny piece of the story. About 90% of an iceberg is underwater, which means it has a huge impact on the world beneath it. As icebergs move around in the shallow nearshore waters, they physically scour and bulldoze the seabed, limiting what organisms can settle and survive here. So it means we often have to dive deeper before we start to find the most life. These waters might be cold, but they are rich in dissolved oxygen and nutrients, and they support a surprising diversity of life that's uniquely adapted for this extreme environment. The benthic or seafloor communities here are dominated by invertebrates. These are animals without backbones, most commonly represented often by our sea stars. These belong to the group known as Echinoderms, which have 5-part symmetry, and some are the most common and huge variety of shapes and sizes and colors that we see in Antarctica. The key characteristic of these sea stars and the key to their success is that they have a unique water vascular system, and this powers hundreds or even thousands of tiny tube feet on their underside. They might look like suction cups, but the gripping action actually is made of adhesive chemicals, and as well as allowing them to stick to or move along pretty much any surface, these tube feet are also incredibly important sensory structures and enable the sea star to detect odors around the seafloor like their food. They might look pretty, but the sea stars are some of the most voracious and dominant predators in any seafloor environment and will eat almost anything they come across. When they find a meal, they'll evert one of their 2 stomachs, outside of their body to engulf and digest the food before slurping it all back up. And this is a strategy which allows them to feed on prey that's much larger than their mouths. If that wasn't terrifying enough, well, sometimes sea stars break the rules. Meet the Labadiaster sea star, also known as the Death Star. While most sea stars have the typical 5 arms, these have up to 50 long, flexible arms that they can extend up into the water column to catch swimming prey like krill or fish. This clip was from my first ever trip to Antarctica. You can see just how big they are. I was so mind blown to find something like this that I had to count how many arms it has. In case you can't read my giant gloved hands there, that was 43 arms on that one. The weirdness continues in the extended family of the sea stars. This spaghetti-looking monster is known as a basket star. I filmed this one off the southern tip of South America. They generally live in deep sea habitats, so it's always super exciting to find one. And compared to their scary predatory relatives, they rely on just the simple strategy of surface area. So they stick their continuously branching arms out into the water column to form this basket that can help them catch any food that's drifting by in the water. And even more unique is this amazing creature. This is a crinoid or a feather star. And these also rely on surface area. Those many branched feather-like arms, those help filter and catch prey from the water, but they also occasionally use them to swim around in the water. And these are just the echinoderms, some of the most amazing, some of my favorite invertebrates you can find in cold water, but don't get me started on sea cucumbers. So moving to something that's much more cryptic, but continuing with the leggy theme, one of the best things to find to remind you that you're diving in Antarctica are the sea spiders. These are completely different to our land spiders, and although they're found in all the oceans, there's over 200 species found in Antarctica, over 100 of which are found nowhere else in the world. They often have 8, but sometimes 10 or even 12 legs. And the males carry the eggs, like you can see here. But what's really cool about them are their adaptations to having such a tiny body. Most of their organs extend into their legs where there's more room. They have one of the most unique circulatory systems described to science, and that is that they absorb oxygen directly through their skin and then pump the blood around their body with muscular contractions of their guts, which extend throughout their legs. These are bottom-dwelling carnivores. They feed on soft animals by liquefying their prey with the proboscis. And although they can reach leg spans of about a foot across, most are much smaller, like this tiny one here. Something a little bit more familiar, but actually one of the least common animals to see underwater in Antarctica are fish. We sometimes go entire trips without seeing a single one, but they're nonetheless fascinating in their adaptations. About 90% of the fish in Antarctica belong to a group called the nodothenoids, otherwise known as the Antarctic cods, and these are highly endemic to the Southern Ocean. Their most famous adaptation for surviving sub-zero temperatures is that they have antifreeze proteins which inhibit the formation of ice crystals within their tissues. How cool is that? They also don't have a swim bladder, so they live their life on the bottom and tend to be pretty elusive and often small. And although we don't see big schools of fish swimming around in Antarctica, it doesn't mean there's nothing to see up in the water column. Possibly one of the coolest creatures to find swimming around anywhere is this tiny, barely a couple centimeters long, transparent swimming sea slug, best known as a sea angel. Otherwise known as a pteropod, which literally means wing foot, this gastropod has transformed its muscular foot that it would typically use for locomotion on the seafloor into these two wing-like paddle appendages that it used to power itself around the ocean at a great whopping speed of about 0.2 miles per hour. That may not sound like much, but that's twice as fast as its favorite prey, which also happens to be its closest relative. And it hunts them by shooting these grappling hook-like sacs out of their heads to pull the snails clear out of their shells, which they then swallow whole. So fascinating and scary, and I hope that you've already eaten your lunch. While those are all really interesting, it's important to remember that some animals live their life in one place. They don't move, and sometimes it's the simplest organisms that are the most interesting in cold waters. Sponges are the simplest multicellular animals on the planet. So simple, in fact, that scientists believe they were plants until the 1800s. They may not have organs or even tissues, but they have a variety of specialized cells that allow them to be highly efficient filter feeders. As well as being some of the most unique and colorful structures that we see in the seafloor communities here, the cold waters promote incredibly slow growth rates, and they're some of the largest and the oldest living structures in Antarctica. Some individuals have even been recorded to live for over 1,000 years. Some creatures, on the other hand, may look simple, but are actually surprisingly complex. It may not look like much, but this immobile filter feeder here is one of my all-time favorite organisms to show people, because this, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, is your closest living invertebrate relative. This is a sea squirt, otherwise known as a tunicate, and in its larval stage, they have a notochord or a spinal cord structure and swim around just like a tadpole. When they're adults, they attach and live their life in one place and use these inhalant and exhalant siphons to take in and filter water. And I love this clip. If you look really closely, you can see the individual particles going into that in-current siphon. But what's really cool about them, and really unique among animals, is that a large portion of their body structure, or the outer tunic, is made of cellulose. That's the same structure that's found in plant cell walls, and is actually among the only cellulose structure known to occur in the animal kingdom. They may not have a true brain, but they have a heart and gonads and a digestive system. And if you're still struggling to see the resemblance here, remember that as larvae, they're technically more advanced than their adult form, which might remind you of some humans on this planet. Now, when we learn of all these amazing creatures that are slow growing and live their life in one place, we realize the importance of the vertical substrate in this environment to provide a safe habitat for these kinds of organisms to thrive. So everything like big walls or sides of shipwrecks, we can see just how amazing it is, how much life there is here in cold water. You can see pretty much every inch of the substrate is covered with life. And it's not just sponges and tunicates, it's things like anemones and even corals. Yes, this is coral. There is coral in Antarctica. It's a soft coral, not a reef-building coral, but it's coral nonetheless. But the cool thing is that scenes this colorful and complex, these are something that we usually associate with warm water environments. But remember, this water is below freezing. This is a picture of my dive computer that's reading -2 degrees Celsius. So finally, one of my favorite things about diving in cold water, and possibly one of the most underrated ecosystems on the planet, are the kelp forests. Although there are thousands of different species of macroalgae of all different shapes, sizes, and colors, the largest and most plentiful in the Southern Ocean are those beautiful brown seaweeds. In Antarctica, we most commonly see this amazing species that I like to refer to as giant lasagna sheets of kelp. Their blades are 1 meter wide and nearly 10 meters long and easily drapes along or carpets any site. Moving slightly north to the slightly less freezing waters of South Georgia, we also find the giant kelp, Macrocystis. You might be familiar. This is the same species that forms the famous kelp forests off of California. And it's capable of reaching heights of 30 meters or 100 feet tall and growing as much as 60 centimeters or 2 feet per day. So this is the largest of all the algae in the ocean and one of the fastest growing organisms on Earth. They form these incredible forest structures and support an unbelievable diversity of life. They provide food as well as habitat and real estate for organisms to live higher up in the water column, and of course protection and structure for a whole heap of things to live beneath them. They are absolutely stunning to experience and swim through, and they're as important to the underwater ecosystem as tropical rainforests are to those above. But they're not just important for life underwater, they're incredibly important for our lives as well. You might be familiar with the components that make them flexible, used in everyday items like toothpaste and beer, and most importantly, ice cream, all the essentials in life. But if that's not enough to be thankful for, as photosynthetic organisms, these are also an important component to contributing more than half of the oxygen that we are breathing right now. So every second breath you take, you can say thank you to the ocean. The ocean covers more than 70% of our planet and is so much more than just a source of food. I hope this has helped to give you just a little bit more of an appreciation for some of the incredible things that live in cold water, and that life in the ocean is not just fascinating, but important and worth caring about. And no appreciation for the ocean would be complete without some of the most alien creatures. This is the only octopus I have ever filmed in Antarctica, so I'm going to let this guy roll in the background while I answer some questions. All right. Shoo. Starting from the top. Do I have snacks? Yes. What's the best thing I've ever seen? In Antarctica, this octopus was a big highlight for me. Also the crinoid, the big feather star. It's the only one I've ever seen or filmed down there. But I would be rude to not include encounters with leopard seals. They are very intimidating, but very beautiful animals. Is it uncomfortable? In terms of the temperature and the experience of diving in freezing or below freezing waters, by the time you put on all those layers and all the effort to get ready, you're not overheating, but you don't really care what the temperature is. And also the only thing that's exposed or left exposed are tiny parts of your face. And the water is sort of so cold that it feels hot, and it goes numb in a few seconds. So it's character building is probably a better way to describe it than uncomfortable. It's cold, but it's worth it. How long is the longest starfish that I've ever seen? Those Labadiaster sea stars are very close in size to the largest sea stars on the planet. The Labadiasters, I think, get up to a maximum size of about 40, 50 centimeters or more. But the biggest ones, the sunflower sea stars that are on the Pacific Northwest, where I've been diving with them in Alaska, get even bigger, and they're a couple feet across. They're absolutely huge, and they're very similar structure to the Labadiaster, the Death Stars, but they're much fatter and bulkier, and they move very fast. What would you say the most needed species in the Antarctic Ocean? The best answer for that, I would say, are tied for first, the phytoplankton and the krill. The Antarctic krill is considered the keystone species of the Southern Ocean ecosystem. Basically everything either eats krill or eats something that eats krill, but the krill is packaging up that phytoplankton, those primary producers, to transfer those nutrients to everything that eats it. So the two of them together are by far the most important things that are in the Antarctic ecosystem. Why are there so few fish? Is it simply too cold? Cold definitely has a big thing to do with it. And to go with that answer, the relatives of the bony fish, the cartilaginous fish, sharks and rays, you don't really have any of those down in Antarctica. The only modern representatives of those are a couple species of skates, which are close relatives of rays. And other than that, you don't have those down in Antarctica. They were in the fossil records when it was a little bit warmer, but now not so much. But it's also a combination for mobile things like fish and sharks and rays. It's a combination of being able to survive in the cold, but also being able to make it all the way there. So to animals that can make the journey from other parts of the world to Antarctica would have too high of a metabolism to then survive in the cold, and ones that do have a low enough metabolism or the adaptations to survive in the cold wouldn't have a high enough metabolism to make the journey to Antarctica. That could change in a changing climate, but that's a little bit of an insight into what determines the vertebrates that you have in Antarctica. How long can you stay down in the ocean without coming up? It depends what sort of gear you're using and what your tolerance to the cold is. A typical dive for us depends on your air consumption, your tolerance to the cold, what you're filming, what there is to see, but also because we're part of a bigger expedition operation, also sort of the time window we have to make our dive. On average, we try to do dives that are about 45 minutes long. A really, really good dive, thanks to wearing a heated vest that keeps me that little bit warmer, I'll stay down for about an hour. What would the seaweed be? Would the seaweed be a good alternative for lasagna sheets? That's actually a great question. You might not be familiar, but seaweeds are edible. But the interesting thing about seaweeds in Antarctica is that they've been found to have chemical defenses, and that's why when you're in an ecosystem that doesn't really have the same sort of organisms that you have in all of the other kelp forest ecosystems on the planet, they have to rely on different defenses to make sure that not everything eats them. And so a lot of, or most of the seaweeds that are in Antarctica have chemical defenses. I don't know if that means that humans can't eat them, but I'd say sure. I think that lasagna sheet kelp might make a good alternative for lasagna sheets in a pinch. I don't know if Shackleton used that idea, but maybe they did and someone didn't make it. Do you see penguins or whales underwater, and which one wins in a race? In Antarctica, I've only seen penguins underwater. I have had a dive where whales were really close when we rolled in. But the cool thing about seeing whales in Antarctica is that they're in cold waters during their summer feeding period, which means that they're not singing to mate. So even though they were very close, and I've heard lots of whales singing underwater before, I've never even heard them singing underwater in Antarctica, which is surprising just because there's so many there during the summer periods. So I haven't seen whales underwater in Antarctica, only penguins, and I would vote penguins would win. They're pretty speedy. All right. Well, I think that's all the questions. Thanks everyone for joining. If you have any more questions after the fact, feel free to reach out, message me. My Instagram link is in the details below. I can add my email as well. But yeah, thanks for joining. Hope that wasn't too nerdy. Enjoy the rest of your day.